Watch Dogs, the ultimate spy and espionage open world game. I loved the previous two installments despite their respective drawbacks. But being from England, when I heard that the series was coming to London, my excitement was through the roof. Little did I know at the time that this would be categorically the worst installment in the series thus far. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, it helps me so much as a small channel. But with that quickly out the way, let's get into this retrospective on Watch Dogs Legion. Watch Dogs was once Ubisoft's bold attempt to modernise the open world formula, a game about surveillance, power, and the idea that information itself could be used as a weapon. It wasn't perfect, but it was ambitious. But by the time Watch Dogs Legion released in 2020, the series had already reinvented itself once. The gritty revenge story of Watch Dogs 1 gave way to the brighter and more playful tone of Watch Dogs 2, a game that quietly became a fan favourite, for me included. So when Ubisoft promised a third entry set in London, built around the idea that you could play as anyone, it sounded like the natural evolution of the series, and an exciting concept we haven't seen in open world games before. Legion wasn't just marketed as a sequel, it was positioned as a revolution. No main characters, no fixed identities, and just an entire city of potential with so many protagonists, each with their own lives, skills, and stories. On paper, it was one of the most interesting concepts Ubisoft had pitched in years, and a breath of fresh air after all of the rehashes we have been getting previously. A world where resistance wasn't led by a hero, but by ordinary people. A Watch Dogs game that leaned fully into its themes of surveillance, control, and authoritarian power. And for a brief moment it worked. The opening of Watch Dogs Legion suggests a darker, more focused experience. One that understands the weight of its setting and the consequences of its ideas. It feels like Ubisoft finally found a way to mature the series without losing what made it unique. But that promise doesn't last. As Legion unfolds, the systems meant to empower the player slowly begin to hollow out the experience. The city becomes less personal, the story loses its urgency, and the very mechanics that were meant to define the game start working against it. So the question isn't whether Watch Dogs Legion had good ideas. It absolutely did, and I encourage Ubisoft to keep trying new ideas, as it's what keeps the gaming industry fresh. But the main question is how a game that begins with so much potential ends up feeling so empty. And to understand that, we need to go back to the very first mission. The opening for Watch Dogs Legion is one of the strongest introductions Ubisoft has released in years. The game immediately drops you into a coordinated DedSec operation spread across London, switching between multiple operatives as they infiltrate secure locations, hack infrastructure, and move towards a single objective. It's a tightly structured opening that prioritizes clarity, pacing, and controlled freedom. Right away, the tone feels different from Watch Dogs 2, and it's hard not to draw comparisons to a James Bond-style spy thriller. The mission presentation leans into the aesthetic, calm mission briefings, sleek UI, high-tech gadgets, and a sense of professionalism rather than chaos. Instead of improvisational hacking, you're disabling drones, hijacking security systems, and navigating restricted areas under the constant watch of Albion, the main antagonists for this game. They're a private military force already deeply embedded throughout London. It feels less like a sandbox and more like an infiltration sequence designed to make the player feel competent and in control of the gadgets they have at their fingertips. The mission structure reinforces this feeling. You're given multiple entry points, clear objectives, and hacking tools that actually shape how you approach encounters. Stealth is encouraged, combat feels deliberately restrained in the opening, and failure carries immediate consequences. It's a focused design that suggests Legion is aiming for a more grounded, cinematic experience, rather than the broad experimentation Ubisoft is usually known for. The bombing at the end of the mission is where the setup fully commits. DedSec is framed for a mass casualty attack and within minutes the group is dismantled, its members arrested or killed. London shifts from a heavily monitored city to an openly occupied one, with Albion granted sweeping authority and surveillance across the city and all of its people. Narratively, this moment does a lot of work. It establishes the main antagonist force, justifies the city's lockdown, and sets the foundations for a resistance built from ordinary citizens rather than a single hero. And for a brief time, the player's anyone mechanic which is introduced here feels like it has a real thematic weight and justification for being in the game. But even here, the limitations are visible. The operatives you control during the opening are intentionally disposable. They exist to demonstrate the mechanics rather than build attachment, and that design choice quietly highlights a problem Legion never fully overcomes: the absence of a consistent perspective. The opening mission feels effective because it's tightly scripted, and once that structure fades, so does the sense of urgency. The spy thriller pacing, the tension, and the feeling that every action matters gradually gives way to a repetitive loop focused on recruitment and system management. In hindsight, the opening doesn't just introduce Watch Dogs Legion, it misrepresents it, unintentionally so. It presents a version of the game driven by narrative momentum and atmosphere, a London that feels dangerous, and a DedSec that feels unified. That version of the game lasts for about an hour, and after that, Legion becomes more mechanical, less personal, and far less confident than its opening suggests. And that contrast defines almost everything that goes wrong afterwards. But before we get into all of that, I want to discuss a few of the positives. It's important to acknowledge what the game genuinely does well, because Legion isn't a bad game due to a lack of ideas. In many ways it fails because its ideas are so ambitious. The most obvious strength is the player's anyone mechanic that they introduced here. As a concept, it's one of the boldest mechanics Ubisoft has ever attempted. Every non-playable character you see walking the streets of London can be recruited into DedSec, each with their own routines, relationships, professions, and abilities. And on a technical level alone, that's impressive. It reframes the open world not as just a backdrop, but as a pool of potential stories. At its best, the system reinforces Legion's core themes. This isn't a resistance led by a chosen hero. It's built from ordinary people, reacting to an authoritarian system in different ways. A construction worker can use a cargo drone to bypass restricted areas. A security guard already has access to weapons and checkpoints. A delivery driver blends into restricted zones without raising suspicion. These roles meaningfully affect how you approach missions, and early on that flexibility feels refreshing, and something that hasn't been seen in games like this previously. There's also something inherently compelling about the idea that DedSec isn't a fixed group, but a movement. The game encourages you to think less about character builds and more about problem solving through people. Who you recruit matters mechanically, even if it doesn't always land narratively. And now I just want to talk about the visuals, because visually, Watch Dogs Legion is arguably at its strongest. This version of London is one of the most detailed and recognizable city recreations in any open world game. Landmarks like Westminster, Camden, Piccadilly Circus, and the Thames are instantly identifiable, but it's the smaller details that really sell it. The narrow side streets, the residential blocks, the public transit stations and crowded marketplaces. The city feels really dense in a way many open worlds don't, and it really captures that London aesthetic. You're rarely travelling through empty space. Instead, London feels layered, vertically and horizontally, with alleyways, rooftops, underground routes, and restricted zones woven naturally into the environment. It's a city clearly designed around stealth, hacking, and infiltration, rather than just traversal. The near-future aesthetic also works in Legion's favour. Technology is advanced, but not unrecognisable. Surveillance drones, automated checkpoints, and facial recognition systems feel like believable extensions of modern infrastructure, rather than sci-fi exaggerations. That grounded approach makes the setting more unsettling in a way, especially early on when the city feels more tense and controlled, as it's not too far from our current reality. And for a time, these strengths carry the experience. The flexibility of the recruitment system, combined with a richly detailed London, creates the impression that Legion is setting up something deeper, a game where systemic design and political themes reinforce each other. And that's the frustrating part, because while these ideas are strong and the world is beautifully realized, the execution struggles to sustain that momentum. The system that feels exciting in the first few hours gradually reveal their limits, and the city that initially feels alive begins to feel increasingly static. Legion doesn't fail because it lacks ambition, it fails because it never fully commits to the strengths it introduces here, and that disconnect is where the cracks begin to show. I want to move on to talk about a bit more in depth the play as anyone mechanic that's introduced in this game. At a conceptual level, the mechanic in Watch Dogs Legion is a defining feature, and it deserves credit for how ambitious it is. The idea that every NPC in the city could become a playable character wasn't just a marketing hook, it was a genius attempt to rethink how protagonists work in open world games. Early on, the system feels really empowering. Recruiting different people changes how you approach missions. A construction worker can call in cargo drones, bypass heavy guarded areas, etc. But the problem is that this flexibility never evolves. The first major issue is that most operators lack meaningful distinctions beyond their initial perks. Everything here seems very surface level after you've played for a few hours, and while characters may have different job titles, abilities, and cosmetic traits, they all share the same core animations, movements, combat capabilities, and over time the differences between the operatives start to feel cosmetic rather than systemic. More importantly, the system comes at the cost of narrative cohesion. By removing a central protagonist, Legion removes a consistent emotional perspective for the story. There's no character arc to follow, no personal stakes that develop over time, and no singular voice through which the story is filtered. Instead, dialogue is written to be universally applicable, which leads to conversations that feel vague, repetitive, and very impersonal. This becomes especially noticeable in major story moments when dramatic events occur. The game struggles to respond in a way that feels earned, because the person experiencing them is interchangeable. Whether you're playing as a teenager, a retired worker, or a security officer, the emotional response is largely the same. The story bends around the system rather than the system supporting the story. Procedural generation is another limitation here, as it has been in many games, because operatives are randomly generated. Their personalities, voice lines, and backstories lack depth. Many characters repeat the same phrases, react in the same ways, and blend together after extended play. And it's always been these types of reasons why I think procedural generation isn't where it is and is holding back so many games. What initially feels like a city full of individuals slowly reveals itself to be a collection of templates. The recruitment process itself also becomes very repetitive. Most recruits require similar mission types: hacking a server, sabotaging a target, or rescuing someone from detention. These missions rarely offer meaningful narrative context, which further reduces the sense that these characters are joining DedSec for personal and believable reasons. There's also mechanical imbalances at play. Some operatives are simply better than others, making large proportions of the system irrelevant. Once players discover optimal recruits, such as construction workers or Albion guards, there's little incentive to experiment further with the mechanics. The promise of anyone collapses into clearly only a few superior options which become the meta. Even permadeath, which is meant to add tension and consequences to your actions, struggles to find its footing. While the idea of permanently losing operatives is thematically appropriate, the lack of deep attachment makes those losses feel more like inconveniences than tragedies. And I can see what Ubisoft was going for here with this, but again, it just wasn't as fleshed out and doesn't have the impact I feel they wanted it to have. Characters are easy to replace, and the emotional weight the system aims for rarely materializes. In the end, the player's anyone doesn't fail because it's poorly designed. It fails because it's asked to do too much. It's meant to carry the narrative, define the gameplay, and embody the game's themes all at once. And while it succeeds mechanically in short bursts, it collapses under the weight of those expectations. What Watch Dogs Legion needed wasn't fewer ideas. It needed more focus focus on the ones it had. A smaller cast with deeper characterization, or a central protagonist supported by recruitable allies, could have preserved the system's flexibility without sacrificing the emotional investment in the story. Instead, Legion commits fully to a concept that works best as a supplement and not a foundation. But I don't want this to all be negative, because I do want to commend Ubisoft here for trying something new. And this mechanic definitely does have potential in the next iteration of Watch Dogs. If it was just developed a little bit more, I can see this becoming a really great mechanic in the game. But once the foundations starts to crack, everything built on top of it begins to feel unstable in Watch Dogs Legion, and that's the problem here. Once the novelty of play as anyone starts to wear off, another problem becomes impossible to ignore: the repetition baked into Watch Dogs Legion's core gameplay loop. Because operatives are interchangeable, missions have to be designed in a way that works for all of them, and that constraint quietly flattens the entire experience. Objectives become standardized, encounters are predictable, and progression is driven less by narrative momentum and more by checklist completions. Most of Legion's missions follow the same structure: infiltrate a restricted area, hack a terminal, download or upload data, and then escape the area. And whether you're advancing the main story, recruiting a new operative, or liberating a borough, the tasks rarely change. The locations might look different, but the interactions stay largely the same. This repetition is especially noticeable during recruitment missions. To convince someone to join DedSec, you're almost always asked to perform a favor that fits neatly into the existing mission template. Sabotage a facility, rescue a detained associate, or erase someone's profile from Albion's system. These objectives are functional, but they lack context, personality, or any actual real stakes. The borough liberation system reinforces this fatigue and gameplay loop. Each district requires a series of near identical activities to reduce Albion's control, culminating in a slightly larger mission that still relies on familiar mechanics. There's a sense of progress on paper, but very little evolution in how the game will challenge you. What makes this worse is that Legion introduces most of its tools very early on, and by the midpoint of the game, you've already seen the majority of hacks, gadgets, and enemy types. There are a few new mechanics introduced in the late game to refresh the experience, which means the gameplay loop never meaningfully deepens, it just repeats, leaving you want the game to end by the time you're midway through. The open world structure, which should add variety, ends up amplifying the problems because missions are scattered across the city. They blur together over time without strong narrative beats or character-driven motivations. They begin to feel less like chapters in a story and more like tasks to clear on a checklist, which is becoming ever more prominent in gaming today, especially Ubisoft games. And this is where the lack of a central protagonist becomes even more damaging. With no personal stakes driving the player forward, progression relies almost entirely on systems, and systems, no matter how flexible they are at first, eventually become predictable. Watch Dogs Legion doesn't collapse all at once. Instead, it slowly exhausts the player through this repetitive loop. And by this point, the game isn't asking how you want to play anymore. It's asking how quickly you can repeat the same tasks over and over again without becoming bored out of your mind. It's a very shallow gameplay loop with a good coating of paint. Now, like any open world in this genre, the main way you're going to be traversing is in vehicles. And something that surprised me with Watch Dogs Legion and that I don't understand is how that the vehicle controls in this can somehow be worse than a game like GTA 5, which released over a decade earlier. Driving in Legion feels noticeably less refined than in previous entries. Even Watch Dogs 2. Vehicles lack weight, the steering feels floaty, and acceleration and braking often disconnect from player input. Cars tend to slide awkwardly around corners, and high-speed driving rarely feels precise or satisfying. This wouldn't be as noticeable if driving were optional, but Legion's structure encourages frequent travel across the map. Fast travel does exist, but it often breaks immersion and undercuts the sense of the place and the world that Ubisoft has created, leaving driving as the primary way most players experience the city. There's also a lack of depth to vehicle variety. Different cars may look distinct, but they all handle largely the same. There's little incentive to experiment with vehicles because none of them feel particularly good to control. Motorcycles in particular feel unstable, and minor collisions can send them spinning unpredictably. compared to earlier Watch Dogs games, this feels like a step backwards. Watch Dogs 2 wasn't perfect, but it offered tighter handling, better feedback, and more personality in its vehicles, whereas in Legion, driving feels like a functional necessity rather than an enjoyable system that was developed. What makes this more frustrating is how well designed London itself is, as I previously mentioned. The city's narrow streets, sharp turns, and layered roadways should lend themselves to an engaging driving experience, but the controls rarely rise to meet the environment. Instead of flowing through the city, you're constantly correcting small mistakes, fighting the controls rather than mastering them. Over time, this compounds the existing fatigue with missions, so when missions are already feeling repetitive, clunky traversal only reinforces the sense that the game is more about endurance than engagement, and every trip becomes another reminder of systems that do not work. By the time all of these issues pile up, the shallow operatives, repetitive missions, and clunky traversal, it becomes clear that Watch Dogs Legion's problems aren't isolated mistakes. They're a result of a broader design philosophy that Ubisoft had fully committed to by this point. Legion wasn't built around a story or a character, it was built around systems that Ubisoft wanted to experiment with, and this experimentation definitely did not go the way that they wanted. The play as anyone mechanic didn't just influence the game, it dictated everything about it. The narrative, the mission design, dialogue progression, and even the level structure had to accommodate a theoretically infinite number of protagonists. That kind of constraint forces compromise, and Legion is full of them. To make the system work at scale, characters had to be simplified, dialogue had to be generic, missions had to be repeatable, emotional weight had to be sacrificed for mechanical flexibility. What you gain in freedom, you lose in identity, and Ubisoft consistently chose freedom, and that's why Watch Dogs Legion becomes so forgettable. This reflects a wider Ubisoft philosophy at the time: build games around systems that can scale rather than experience that are curated and tightly authored, with good scripts and good writing. By 2020, Ubisoft's open world formula was well established. Large maps, icon-driven progression, modular missions, and mechanics designed to be reused across dozens of hours, trying to squeeze every hour out of players and create such fatigue that they would inevitably purchase in-game currency or some way to progress quicker. Legion fits neatly into that framework, even when it actively works against the type of story the game is trying to tell. Development context matters here too. Legion went through multiple delays and was released during a period of internal upheaval at Ubisoft, including leadership change and restructuring. The game had to ship, and ambitious ideas like the play as anyone mechanic were simply too foundational to be scaled back without rebuilding the entire project. So instead of refining the concept, Ubisoft doubled down on it. Another factor is monetization. Legion was designed with post-launch content in mind: live service elements, additional operatives, cosmetics, and online modes. Systems-based design is far easier to extend and monetize than narrative-driven content, and Legion's structure reflects that priority. A focused protagonist doesn't sell as easily as a system that promises endless variation. A tight, authored story doesn't scale as well as repeatable activities, and that tension between creative ambition and commercial strategy is at the heart of Legion's identity crisis, and one of the main reasons for its eventual downfall. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Ubisoft clearly understood the problem, at least partially. The addition of characters like Aiden Pierce and Wrench in post-launch content feels like an acknowledgement that players missed having a defined lead, but by then it was too late. Those additions felt more like nostalgia patches than structural fixes to the game itself. Watch Dogs Legion is what happens when innovation is pursued horizontally instead of vertically. Instead of deepening what works in previous games, Ubisoft expanded outwards: more characters, more systems, more scale, without strengthening the foundations beneath them, and that's what led to it all come crashing down. And this isn't a Watch Dogs specific issue, it's something you can see across Ubisoft's catalogue during this era, and still today. Games designed to be big, flexible, and endlessly extendable, often at the cost of focus and cohesion. Legion didn't fail because Ubisoft stopped caring. It failed because it cared too much about the wrong things. Scalability and profit over a good, cohesive narrative. Systems over storytelling. And longevity over impact. And when a game is designed to be everything to everyone and tries too much too quickly, it often ends up not being much of anything at all. So what did you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Did you play Watch Dogs Legion? Did you enjoy it? Do you share the same grievances with the game as me? Let me know down in the comments. And if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Goodbye.